Hey everybody, and welcome to the next episode in our webinar series. This month's topic is experiences of gender-based violence in 2SLGBTQ plus communities. And of course, we've got our warning as usual that some of the content you're about to hear could be a little upsetting for folks, so please practice good self-care and step away or pause the playback if you need to. And also to acknowledge that the Women's Resource Center is located on Treaty 2 territory, and we also operate on Treaty 1 territory, which are the lands of the Anishinaabeg, Cree, Assininew, Assiniboine, Dakota, and Dene peoples, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. So today we're going to be talking about violence in 2S LGBTQ plus communities and gender-based violence. So first we're going to go over what gender identity and sexual orientation are, going to do some definitions, and then we're going to talk about violence and intersectionality. And then we're going to go into talking about the prevalence of violence in 2S LGBTQ plus communities, specific challenges of 2S LGBTQ plus communities experiencing violence. And then, of course, at the end, we'll have our resources and all of our contact information for you. So I think it's important that we start with a discussion about what gender identity and sexual orientation are. Not everybody is aware of the distinctions, so I think it's just good to start out that way. First, by identifying that gender identity and sexual orientation are two different concepts, so they're not able to be used interchangeably. Gender identity is how someone identifies themselves on the spectrum of gender. A person's gender might or might not be the same as what they were assigned at birth. So the sex that somebody was assigned at birth, male or female, might or might not correspond with the gender that somebody is. Gender is also socially constructed, and so it's not the same as a person's sex or quote unquote biology, what they were assigned at birth. And what I mean by socially constructed is that gender is by and large a set of behaviors and norms that have become very normalized within our Western Canadian society. And so based on somebody's perceived gender, we ascribe certain behaviors or aesthetics to them. So we view girls and women in one way and boys and men in another. And that's based on this kind of image of those genders that we've, made up for ourselves in society. Cisgender is a term, or cis, that you might hear when we talk about sex and gender. And it means that the person's gender identity matches up with the gender that they were assigned at birth. So if somebody was assigned a girl at birth and they identify as a girl or a woman, then they are a cisgender girl or a cisgender woman. And transgender or trans means that the person's gender identity differs from the gender that they were assigned at birth. So maybe they were assigned female at birth, but they identify as male or non-binary as they age and kind of explore gender identity. Agender means that a person doesn't see themselves as having a gender. So on that gender spectrum, they feel that they don't fit anywhere on that spectrum, so to say. Non-binary means that a person's gender is neither male nor female, which are the two ends of the traditional gender binary. They could be gender fluid, meaning that their gender expression changes across the spectrum. But yeah, they don't identify as either or. And this is a really good graphic that I like to use when talking about gender identity, rather. It's called the Gender Galaxy, and it was developed by Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights. And it goes over the different gender identities that exist, and then kind of shows how it interacts with assigned sex. On the back of this graphic, there is kind of like definitions and kind of explainers. The link for this graphic is below in the description as well as at the end of the video. So sexual orientation, as opposed to gender identity, describes who a person is attracted to. It could be related to their gender identity or not, could be completely independent. So some of the terms you might generally hear when talking about sexual orientation is heterosexual, meaning a person is attracted to somebody of the opposite gender of them. So for example, if somebody is identifying as a woman and they're heterosexual, then they would be attracted to men, for example. Gay or lesbian means a person is attracted to somebody of the same gender. The term gay historically has been ascribed to men who are attracted to men, but it can also be referring to women who are attracted to women, whereas lesbian is a term that historically has referred to women who are attracted to women. Bisexual is a term meaning when somebody is attracted to either men or women. So for example, a woman who's attracted to both men and women, or a man who's attracted to both men and women, for example. Queer is a term to describe multiple sexual orientations. It's kind of an umbrella term. It's been a term that's been actually reclaimed by the 2SLGBTQ+ community in recent years to kind of be this more of an umbrella term and a descriptor for some folks within that community. Asexual is somebody who's not sexually attracted to anyone. And two-spirit is something that is an Indigenous specific term. And myself, just to situate myself, I'm a white settler background, so I'm not qualified to talk in any depth about two-spirit other than to just give a very brief overview of what it is. It's an Indigenous specific term to describe a person who has male and female spirits within them. It can also be a term that represents specific cultural roles in Indigenous cultures. It can refer to both sexual orientation and gender identity. But there's a lot of history behind that term and a lot of cultural meaning. So if you're wanting more information on two-spirit, there is a resource at the end of the presentation and also in the link below, which is a more in-depth description of what two-spirit is. And just like with the gender galaxy, there's also a sexuality galaxy. So it goes over many different sexual orientations and how they're related to romantic orientations. It shows that it's in the same universe as gender, but that it's not the same thing. And it also differentiates two-spirit. And again, on the back of this graphic, if you follow the link below or at the end of the presentation, there will be definitions and descriptors for all of these terms attached to this graphic, so you can have both at the same time. So the acronym 2SLGBTQ is representative of both gender identities and sexual orientations, which we've just talked about. So 2S is two-spirit, L is lesbian, G is gay, B bisexual, T transgender, and Q for queer or questioning. And the plus indicates other identities or orientation that make up that galaxy, those two galaxy diagrams that we were just looking at. And I think it's important that we talk about violence and gender-based violence directly related to the 2SLGBTQ+ community, because Canada has a significant proportion of citizens that identify as 2SLGBTQ+, approximately 1 million people, or about 4% of our population. And due to stigma and discrimination, both historic and past and current in the present, we know for a fact that 2SLGBTQ individuals tend to experience not only high rates of violence and gender-based violence, but also that they tend to experience it differently. And these different experiences, these added layers of stigma and discrimination also affect the ways in which people seek help and the ways that they receive help. And it's also important to note that 2SLGBTQ+ individuals also experience violence and gender-based violence differently when we take into account other factors. And this is where that intersectionality piece comes in. So 2SLGBTQ folks of different socioeconomic statuses, of different races and abilities and ages also impact how people seek and receive help, how they experience violence and gender-based violence. So it's not just somebody's 2SLGBTQ+ identity that can influence their experiences, but also these intersecting other factors that they may also have going on. So there have been limited studies done on violence in 2SLGBTQ+ communities, but it is a growing field, and there has been some really good research that has come out within the last few years on violence and gender-based violence in 2SLGBTQ+ communities. So the studies that I'm drawing from are from Statistics Canada, which has done work on this, and also from the Resolve Network in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta that has done work on this. So those are they're linked at the end of the presentation and in the bio as well if you want to check them out for yourself. But just to say that is where the bulk of this information is coming from. So outside of the context of intimate partner violence, Statistics Canada found that 2SLGBTQ plus individuals are more likely than non-2SLGBTQ plus individuals to experience violence. So the rates of violence within 2SLGBTQ plus communities are higher. And one study in particular that was a Statistics Canada study found that in the last 12 months within the period that the study was being conducted, 11% of 2SLGBTQ plus community members experienced violence, and that is a rate that's 3 times higher than the rate of violence experienced by non-2SLGBTQ plus community members. So that is a significant number. To have one community experiencing violence at 3 times higher a rate than another community, that's a stark contrast. And this study also found that over their lifetimes, 2SLGBTQ plus individuals are approximately 1.5 times more likely than non-2SLGBTQ plus community members to experience violence and gender-based violence. So that is also significant as well, that and scientifically proves that 2SLGBTQ plus community members experience violence at much higher rates than non-2SLGBTQ plus community members. And specifically, this study also found that transgender Canadians specifically experience much higher rates of violence than cisgender Canadians. So that is a form of gender-based violence as well. This study also found that 2SLGBTQ plus individuals who are also Indigenous experience nearly twice the rates of violence and gender-based violence as non-Indigenous 2SLGBTQ plus individuals. So we just talked about how in general, 2SLGBTQ plus community members already experience much higher rates of violence. And so within that already very high rate of violence, 2SLGBTQ plus folks who are Indigenous are experiencing violence even higher than that. So that is alarming as well, and also important to note. The study also found that 2SLGBTQ plus individuals experience sexual assault at a rate approximately 3 times higher than non-2SLGBTQ plus folks. Again, a very alarming number. And it also found that 2SLGBTQ women tend to experience higher rates of violence and gender-based violence than 2SLGBTQ plus men. So that is kind of in line with what we know about non-2SLGBTQ plus women who experience violence and gender-based violence at higher rates than non-2SLGBTQ plus men. So it's the same within the LGBTQ community and outside of it as well. So there are some specific challenges that 2SLGBTQ plus communities experience when they're experiencing violence. And that's again because of what we've mentioned earlier about the kind of historic and current stigma and discrimination that 2SLGBTQ folks are up against. And this is from a study of out of the Resolve Network, which is a gender-based violence research network that is across the Prairie provinces, so Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. And they found in their study that the most common type of abuse experienced in 2SLGBTQ plus communities is emotional abuse. And then the second most common type was physical abuse. That's similar to what is true in non-2SLGBTQ plus communities as well. But again, there are added factors to consider when talking about violence in the 2SLGBTQ plus community. And in this study that was specifically examining gender-based violence in 2SLGBTQ plus communities, it was found that approximately half of survivors did not report their experiences. And we know that gender-based violence is already a very underreported type of crime in general. So that is something that is also being experienced in the 2SLGBTQ plus community. But again, we're going to go into the specific challenges that that community faces when dealing with violence and gender-based violence. The top reasons cited for why 2SLGBTQ plus folks didn't report gender-based violence or violence against them was a fear of not being believed. They had negative perceptions of police based on prior interactions, and they didn't want others finding out what was happening to them. And when people did choose to report, they often did not do so to police. They chose to report to a counselor or a therapist or a support worker instead of going to the police. again, because of that negative perceptions of police based on prior interactions, and kind of historic stigma and discrimination within many police forces when it's related to 2SLGBTQ plus communities. The study found that also that most folks who did report were not happy with how their disclosure was handled. And especially in the case of racialized 2SLGBTQ plus folks, all were not happy with how their disclosure was handled. One of the most important takeaways from this Resolve study that I found was that even though 2SLGBTQ plus communities experienced the same types of violence as non-2SLGBTQ plus communities, there was an added negative experience with police concerns or considerations as a result of being 2SLGBTQ plus individuals. So for example, fear of being outed by somebody, fear of withholding medications, for example, in the case of transgender individuals who are in the midst of a medical transition. So those are two very specific types of emotional and psychological abuse that 2SLGBTQ plus community members face when we're talking about gender-based violence. There were also challenges noted with regards to the informal supports that were available to folks, such as their family and friends, specifically around concerns over being outed or not being accepted if the survivor disclosed their experiences. So someone's family might not know that they were a part of the 2SLGBTQ plus community, and if they were to disclose their experience of intimate partner violence or gender-based violence, then they would risk being outed, and that would be, potentially not a good thing if the survivor knew that they would likely not be accepted by their family or friends. And there were also specific barriers to help seeking that were identified in this Resolve study, which included stigma or shaming by service providers because of gender identity or sexual orientation, fears around discrimination, and lack of 2SLGBTQ plus specific services. So this is exactly what we mean when we say that there are added challenges around gender-based violence and violence when we're talking about 2SLGBTQ plus communities experiencing violence and how it can impact their abilities to seek help and to receive help. Some other barriers to disclosure and help seeking were related to myths and misinformation about violence in 2SLGBTQ plus communities. So the most common myths are that violence and gender-based violence only happens in heterosexual relationships, which, as we've seen here, is not the case. Another myth is that men aren't abused and also that women aren't abusers. This is, of course, not true. As we've seen, it is more common for women to be the survivors and men to be the perpetrators, but that is, of course, not like a hard and fast rule. Men are also abused and women are also abusers. There's also the mischaracterization of violence in lesbian relationships specifically. There's this myth that people think that it doesn't happen at all, or if it does, it's just a quote unquote cat fight. So there's that misogyny thrown in there and sexism thrown in there. And of course, violence can happen in lesbian relationships, just as it can happen in any other type of relationship. There's also the myth of mutual abuse. Mutual abuse is not something that exists. Abuse is always based on a power differential. So if they're, oftentimes what happens is if a partner is being physically abused and they quote unquote fight back, then it's characterized as mutual abuse, where in reality, the partner exercising the power differential is the abusive partner, and the partner who quote unquote fought back was engaging in self-defense in reality. There's also a mischaracterization of violence in many gay relationships or relationships of two men, the idea that boys will be boys. And that's really just an excuse for violence. It perpetuates cycles of violence and is really not helpful for somebody experiencing intimate partner violence. And again, kind of in relation to what we were talking about before, the masculine presenting partner is always the abusive partner. That is a myth. So for example, in heterosexual relationships, we know that men can be abused and that women can be abusers, but we also know that in lesbian relationships that the masculine presenting partner, if there is a masculine presenting partner, is not always going to be the abusive partner. Yeah, it's a myth that is the case, and it's not accurate, and it is not helpful to assisting survivors of gender-based violence and integral partner violence. Experiences of violence and GBV in 2SLGBTQ+ communities also vary based on someone's specific identity. So for example, transgender folks might experience emotional abuse meant to cause gender dysphoria, which can come in the form of consistent and intentional misgendering or deadnaming, which can cause folks to, again, have an increase in that gender dysphoria, or bisexual women often experience biphobia and bi-erasure as forms of emotional abuse, so kind of denying somebody's identity on purpose to make them kind of question or get emotional injuries is also a form of emotional abuse. And finally, here's our resources. The bulk of the statistical information came from the top two resources, but there were also some infographics that I thought were good to include as well, including those gender and sexuality galaxy graphics. And then finally, at the bottom there, you'll see a resource that is a more in-depth explainer on the two-spirit identity. And finally, our contact information here is for anybody who would like to contact us at any point, so please feel free to do that. That's all we've got for you today, and we will see you next time.